Hi, I'm Phil Kuzno, author of The Art of Pilgrimage. Watch Author with Joe Skelly on Sunday and Tuesday nights at 9:30 on Metro Cable Network, Channel 6. Trust me, he really does read them.
The following program is sponsored by Asian Pages Newspaper, the leading Asian resource serving the Midwest. Lehman Strobel, PLC of St. Paul, providing legal and business affairs services to the entertainment and multimedia communities.
Welcome to this edition of Author. I'm Joe Skelly. Today's show is the second of a two-part series on the life and work of Ralph Rapson, one of the most influential modern designers and architects of the 20th century. We are very honored to have Mr. Rapson as our guest for this half hour. His appearance follows Sunday's show, which introduced the new book, Rapson, 60 Years of Modern Design, which was co-authored by Jane King Hession, Rip Rapson, and Bruce Wright. The biography coincides with the joint exhibitions of Rapson's work at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and the Wiseman Art Museum opening on March 27th. Rapson is best known in Minnesota for designing the Guthrie Theater and leading the University of Minnesota School of Architecture to national prominence for 30 years. Rapson started practicing as an architect before World War II, and is still active today with projects domestically and abroad. Famous architect Cesar Pelli has said this about him: Ralph Rapson is now a legend in the history of modern architecture. Mr. Rapson, welcome to the show. It's a great honor.
Thank you.
What does it mean to you to have a book on your life and work and the exhibits at the Institute of Arts and the Wiseman?
Well, it's all very exciting, I must say. Something that I never thought would probably happen, but it's remarkable from my point of view, and I only hope that people will find as they go through the book and through the exhibit, they will find this sort of exciting.
Now,
for me, it's been very exciting.
You first saw the book last week. What was your first impression?
My first impression was, well, certainly good. It's interesting in doing a book like this. My feeling originally was I'd like to be very much involved in doing it, but I finally determined that both with the book and with the exhibit that I would bow out of it completely and just let the pros do their job, same as I would like by and large to have clients treat me when I'm doing a building. But so I think the three authors have done a marvelous job, and the young lady that did Christy that did the graphics has put just an enormous amount of material together in a very exciting and I think intriguing way that should I think be quite interesting, particularly to architects, hopefully a lot of other people.
Mm-hmm. And you say you kind of bowed out, but you were very much involved in terms of they spent hours and hours interviewing you, going through your archives.
No, I wouldn't say I bowed out. I bowed out of doing any design work.
Trying to be in control,
I supplied him with all the materials that I could, and no, they've been rummaging through old drawings and records and so on for the last couple of years, and so it's but it's certainly a thrill to see it finally materialize.
I want to read something they wrote in the introduction. The author said, "Some might find it curious that the word architect does not appear on the cover of this book. There is no denying that Ralph Rapson is a highly talented architect. However, in constructing this retrospective study, we found the term to be too limiting, identifying only one aspect of his most interesting life. Our title then seeks to reflect this professional longevity, his aesthetic viewpoint, and his versatility. More important, Rapson is a modernist." Now, when you were young, you actually wanted to be an artist first, didn't you?
I think in my younger days, I often thought of, because I had been drawing all my life, but I got the usual kinds of advice that, oh, you can't make a living at that sort of thing. And so I gradually became interested in an incident. It was sort of amusing. I was keeping company with a young lady in high school whose father was a carpenter. I think one of the first times that I visited the girl, I discovered the American Builder and a few of those carpenter-esque type buildings, and that partially pushed me into thinking about architecture.
Now, this was at her home, right? You were
At her
visiting
home,
at her
yes,
home,
yeah.
the stories in
Yeah.
the book, and you didn't really pay enough attention to her, it sounded like.
Well, I have to confess that I haven't read all of this in the book. I know that Rip and Jane have been, we've conducted a lot of interviews, but, and I've skimmed it. I wasn't certain that that story was in the book, but no, Opal. We used to joke a lot about Opal.
Now, you kind of took your education into your own hands from a young age. There wasn't a great art program at school, it sounded like, and you went to a 2-year college in your small town in Michigan, and you kind of designed your own course, didn't you?
Yes, well, like many small towns, there wasn't much of an
This
art.
was before World War I.
Right, there wasn't much of an art program, and I took 3 years of the typical mechanical drawing that often occurs in schools, and but the 4th year I became impatient with that, and so the instructor allowed me to chart my own course, and then that also followed when I went to the local college, Alma College. I put together a 2-year program of educating myself about architecture and drawing and that sort of thing. So I was fortunate in a way to. So when I finally did go away to study architecture, I had a fairly good start on almost all of my colleagues. I had 2 years of fairly intense study, both from a history point of view and from a techniques point of view.
And hours and hours and hours and years of drawing. I mean,
I
that's something that Jane and Rip brought out in the previous interview.
Yeah, I love to draw.
When did you realize that you could maybe make some money doing this?
I don't know. I've never realized that yet. No, I'm joking a little bit, but our office, so-called office, is not really an office in the sense of most architectural offices. I think if we break even, we think we're doing well. No, I think our drive is to do significant architecture and significant environmental work, and the bottom line financially hasn't always been that critical.
The authors wrote, Rapson was part of an exhilarating, revolutionary era in American architecture. He was taught by, studied, and taught with, was hired by, and collaborated, and sometimes crossed swords with many of the true luminaries of modern architecture and design. Name a few of these greats that impacted you.
Oh boy. Well, I have been very fortunate, and partially it was of my own choice, but very early on I got to know Frank Lloyd Wright, and then following that I went to Cranbrook, where I worked with Eliel Saarinen, one of the great masters of modern architecture, and his son, who went on to even excel him. The Saarinens were a very great influence on my thinking. I then later had several years working with Moholy Nagy from the famous Bauhaus in Germany. Later on, I worked with Alvar Aalto, one of the top architects of all time, Bill Wurster, any number of people. I got to know Corbusier, one of our gods in architecture. So that I've been very, very fortunate in getting to know and to work closely with some of these very stimulating and wonderful people.
I think Frank Lloyd Wright was like 71 when you met him. You were probably 24 or so, and you
right.
spent a week with him on fellowship with a few other students. And there's a great story in the book about the last day, if you want to relate that.
Yes, that three of us went up to Taliesin over a Easter holiday. We had written to Wright asking if we could come and visit, and he agreed, and so we spent a week at Taliesin West, or Taliesin East, I'm sorry.
Wisconsin.
During that week, Wright was the model host. We practically lived with the man for a week. He spent an incredible amount of time with us and talked about architecture and life, and it was really a memorable experience. At that time, in Wright's place, basically you paid to go there. Yeah, I think the going rate at that point was maybe around $1,400. I think it became evident during that week that none of us had $1,400.
You didn't have the dough.
We didn't have the dough, and perhaps this led to Wright's change in his approach to us, because, as I say, for 1 week he was so gracious, so outgoing and thoughtful. Over the weekends, usually on Sunday evening at Taliesin, there's it's a kind of a black tie affair. They have fine dinner and guests, and usually Wright will hold forth. Which he did that night, but he set the three of us down out in the middle of the room and proceeded to interrogate us about, what do you think about this, or what do you think about that? And I must say that I was certainly in awe of the situation, with all the pomp and ceremony around me, and this man challenging us. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And most of the time, probably fumbling out pretty feeble-like responses. But finally, he dismissed us with a kind of and I still recall, there, folks, there, look, there you see 4 examples of higher education in this country. Wright never had much belief and conviction of higher education, particularly in architecture. He might have in other fields, I don't know, but in architecture, he was essentially a self-educated man. But so he was pretty negative about most architectural training. And it's funny, I don't know, when I first came out to Minnesota, I'd kept some correspondence with Wright, but when I came to Minnesota, I decided that very first that we would have Wright come on as a lecturer. I blew our whole lecture budget in one
guy.
person, but he did come, and finally, after quite a bit of negotiating, and I remember when we met, he came into my office, and he paused, and he looked me up and down for what seemed like an interminable time. Finally he said, so this is what you've finally sunk to. He was full of things like, I suppose there was a bit of a twinkle, but he could be a pretty sharp, critical person at times, and other times he was warm and friendly, and he's always been a great influence on my life.
How would you compare your work with his?
Well, I believe I read and I often quote from his writings, but I do not use his vocabulary, and that is his architectural vocabulary. Wright was, as we know it, as the prairie school of low horizontality and natural materials and that sort of thing. And many of these are principles which I certainly would agree with, but I have never tried to use his, well, again, vocabulary in my own buildings. I would think that most of the people who have tried to imitate Wright in their building have failed miserably. He's so unique and so personal that it's one should not. And I feel that about practically every architect. I like to find my own way, if possible, my own expression.
How would you describe your design, though, in your own
Well,
words?
I suppose I would be labeled more an internationalist, if you will, and I've been labeled a modernist. For me, modernism is also a bit of a misnomer. I think, and I would go back to what Wright has often said, that any design assignment, you essentially try to find the essence of that particular assignment. Style has nothing to do with it. It's finding what really is behind what's the meaning of what you're doing, and that can be that can take different expressions with different kinds of work and different situations and different people, different climatic conditions, so that I have attempted always to find that trueness in any particular project. And whether it's, and I've often told students the same thing, I don't care what it looks like, but it must come from the heart, and it must come from a real understanding of the hopes and aspirations and the convictions and desires of yourself and the people you're working for.
You came to Minnesota in 1954. You accomplished so much. You led the School of Architecture for 30 years, but there's a quote in the book that over 40 years, your students won 27 times out of the 40 years they won this traveling fellowship. Your legacy there is amazing. You designed many buildings in Minnesota, and of course, you're known so well by the Guthrie. I'm going to read a little quote, and this is the author's quoting you about the Guthrie, talking about Tyrone Guthrie. You say, even though we would fight, oh my, we had some really beautiful fights. We would return the next day as if nothing had happened. I think Guthrie was calculating in this, trying to pull the best concepts out of me. He forced me to defend every idea and to improve on a great many of them. He was an SOB right from the word go, but innovative and exciting to work with. When all was said and done, it was a strangely balanced give and take.
You say that was written by Rip and Jane?
Quoting you.
Quoting me. Well, I think it's...
Were you being nice there?
I was writing in yes, time had healed a bit of the wounds. Now, it was, I've been very critical of Guthrie, and he was critical of me, but I must say that it was a stimulating and exciting and dynamic kind of man to work with. So many clients or so many situations, one doesn't really have to really work at a project. As I said in that quote, I hated the man at times, but in retrospect, I suppose I really do think that was probably his way of forcing me to do the very best that I could possibly do.
Now, is the Guthrie one of your favorite buildings in Minnesota? What would be your favorites in Minnesota that you designed?
My favorite building would be the one I'm working on at the present time, which that's an evasive answer. No, I think the Guthrie would be one of my favorites. One can't divorce the experience of what you do with the actual product that you've produced. So the people one works with and the situation, the background. And certainly doing a theater is a very exciting kind of venture, much more so than many others. And because in this particular case I had been told, this is your client, work with him, and so it was really a situation of the two of us, you know. He had certain definite, I suppose one of my greatest disappointments was that Tony didn't really appreciate or understand perhaps the role of the architect. And I don't think it became somewhat apparent to me in the very beginning that basically he was looking for someone probably to draw up his ideas. I was certainly interested in solving his problems, but as I told him, it was after finding out all of the needs and the requirements and the aspirations and all of that, that it was the architect's job to put that into three-dimensional physical form. And it was both my moral and my legal obligation. That happened in our very first meeting, incidentally, and in which he had explained to me his notion of what the theater should be. And as I say, in that conversation, it became apparent that he did not understand what I, as an architect, could bring to the assignment. I was naive enough, I suppose. I didn't know exactly the great stature of this man. He was certainly one of the leading directors of all time, and I had probably not done my homework, so I was brash enough to tell him how I felt and what I felt an architect's assignment was. And that all got us off to a rather cozy beginning.
Now, after talking to the authors several times off camera, it sounded to me like, I mean, you've had a great influence on 20th century architecture, and many of the greats acknowledge that. But they said, I mean, you were offered plum jobs at Harvard, at Princeton. You probably didn't get as much notoriety because you're here in the Midwest instead of on the East or West Coast. Did you ever regret that you stayed in Minnesota?
I suppose I did. As you know, I went from Chicago, leaving the Institute of Design, the new Bauhaus, out to teach at MIT. And I remember having conversations with Mahaly about that. Mahaly would say, why don't you stay here in Chicago? It's like you'll be a big fish in a smaller pond, perhaps, but out there you'll be a smaller fish. But the lure to go out east, of course, is great for any young architect, and the challenges of that sort. But I did go out. Agreed that I would go for 4 years only. I'm a Midwest product. I have always felt more comfortable in the Midwest, and as a matter of fact, as you mentioned, I have had opportunities to go elsewhere, but somehow or other I feel very comfortable in the Midwest, and Minneapolis has been a good place to raise a family and to practice. It's quite true that the East controls an awful lot of our decisions in this country, and one of the things, of course, is that we often send young students out east to study, and I've always made a point of that with our students, that not to take graduate work at their own school, but to go elsewhere. So we did establish quite a strong tradition of sending students to MIT and Harvard and Penn and Yale and other places. Not necessarily because of their architectural programs, but simply to get these young people into a different setting.
Just a little bit of time left. Can you name a couple favorite architects today?
Favorite architects today?
Some of the best young architects, maybe?
Well,
Maybe your former students.
many of them are former students, and I could name a couple dozen of those. Bill Pedersen, who was one of our former students, wrote the foreword in the book. Incidentally, at the opening this next week, there's a whole delegation coming from around the country of former students, and we're going to have a bit of a celebration. And there's at least a dozen of those guys that are good, solid young architects. I admire very much Michael Graves, who was here recently, and he was one of my graduate assistants when I was teaching at Princeton years ago. I've admired